And I remember the day my mother told me after seeing a show of mine that I didn't need to have a plan B anymore. And it was a real pivotal moment because I think for them there was always that fear of like, how do you turn this into a career? You know, it was at NYU that I first heard the expression artist of color. I was like, that makes sense to me. I identify as that. I had not heard that. I didn't know, like I knew I knew there wasn't always space for me, but there was something about a teacher of mine who was talking about being an artist of color, and it helped me find community. You know, I love the expression, there's an expression, it's like, don't put a hat on a hat. If the set is intended to make the play spooky, and the light is intended to make spooky, and the sound is intended to make the play spooky, and the costumes are intended to make the play spooky, like everything is doing the same thing. At a certain point, if everything is spooky, nothing is spooky anymore, right? I think a lot of people come to the theater and they like, sit down, cross their arms, and they like entertain me. But I think of theater as this relationship with an audience, right? Like, what does an audience give back? Applause, laughter, tears, right? But they also give back parts of themselves. They see themselves reflected, and there's a reciprocal relationship, I believe, that wants to happen in the theater that keeps it alive.
We'll start today. We are joined by David Mendizábal, Associate Artistic Director at Berkeley Rep Theater and Producing Artistic Leader at the Movement Theater Company. David develops new work and builds spaces for artists and audiences. He's trained at NYU with a BFA in theater. David has spent years shaping artistic platforms for people of color and for adventurous storytelling that provokes dialogue and civic engagement. David, welcome to the Inference show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Awesome, David. It's a great honor to have you. I've seen some of your work, and it is really interesting. What got you first interested in theater?
Yeah, I always say that my theater introduction actually started with my father. So my father is from Ecuador and is an immigrant. And when he moved to New York when he was 15 years old, didn't speak English, taught himself English, was a New York City cab driver, and then went to law school and started his own immigration firm in Orlando. Well, started it in New York and then moved to Orlando when we moved to when I was raised. And so I always say that my first intro to theater was actually going. When I was in high school, over the summer, I would go and I would work with my dad, and I'd like file papers or make copies. And on certain days, I would get to see him in court. I would go with him to court. And for me, it felt like theater. It felt like watching my dad on a stage performing for an audience. And what he was doing was uplifting the stories of his clients, humanizing them through their own stories and helping them to tell their story, to fight for their own human rights, for asylum and for a better life, And so for me, when I really think back on it, I'm like, that was my first experience of sitting in a room and being moved by the power of storytelling, And so I say it's that, and then watching the touring production of Phantom of the Opera when it came through. So there's the sort of potency and power of what telling one story can do, and then the sort of spectacle and splash and extravagance of this American musical like Phantom of the Opera that I think also told this sort of beautiful story about connection, through song. And so I think those two really sealed for me that like, I want to do that. I want to put stories on stage and uplift stories that can make people feel great, but also can help change people's lives. So I think that really for me was my into theater.
Were you interested in theater growing up?
I was. When I was in middle school, I basically did everything I could to try to avoid playing sports. So, instead of taking a sports elective, you could take a theater elective, right? And so I was like, okay, I'll try that. Growing up when I was little, I was the only boy. amongst my sisters, and also I had a lot of female cousins, and we had a little fireplace hearth, I think it's called. It looks like a little stage in front of a fireplace, which is funny because why do you need a fireplace in Florida, right? But we had this little stage in our living room, and I remember, like gathering my sisters and my cousins and like wanting to put on plays or put on performances. We'd put on magic shows. We'd put on sort of improv performances or just different stage things that we'd do in the living room when we charge people $0.25 to come see it. So I think I always had this interest in like performing and, bossing people around, my sisters. And so then once I started actually doing theater in middle school, there was something really exciting about it. It was exciting to get to put on different characters and go on stage and be someone else and play make-believe and tell stories that made people laugh or made people cry. And so when I was applying for high school, I went to a school called Dr. Phillips in Orlando, and they had a magnet program at the time that was you could apply to get in, and it was a really incredible magnet program with a theater arts department. And so I applied for that. Many incredible artists have graduated from there and have gone on to make big names for themselves. And so I applied for that and I got in, and it was actually interesting because, my mom, I was also really smart. I was one of my high school valedictorians. And my mom was really sort of determined for me to follow in that American dream, sort of like go become a lawyer, take over the family business, right? But I really wanted to do theater. And so it was interesting navigating, my parents were open to it, but I think they were also like, they didn't necessarily see a space for us because they grew up seeing theater, but they didn't grow up seeing their stories on stage. They didn't grow up seeing their stories in movies either. There were very few, actors and performers and stories that centered their lives. And so for them, they were like, it's fun, it's a fun hobby, but how do you make a career out of it, right? When there's not space for us. And that was the thing my mom kept saying. And so, she was always like, this is fun, a fun hobby, but like, what's your plan B? And so when I actually went in to apply for colleges, that was a big conversation I had to have with them, was like, look, I actually want to do this for college. And so the agreement was that you could apply for a liberal arts college. They didn't want me to go to a conservatory, which is a school that just focus on like art, and so in looking at schools, I was looking at places that had incredible theater programs, but also a really strong liberal arts degree, so that you could, I could go, and in case I wanted to open myself up to other things, and that plan B idea always stuck in the back of my head. And I remember the day my mother told me after seeing a show of mine that I didn't need to have a plan B anymore. And it was a real pivotal moment because I think for them there was always that fear of like, how do you turn this into a career?
Yeah, as an immigrant, as a first generation immigrant, your parents worked so hard to give you that opportunity, right? So, that fear, was there in their mind, but they still let you choose.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. And they saw I was passionate about it, and so they still encouraged it, but there was definitely, and I understand it. I think even for me growing up, not seeing my stories on stage, not seeing my families, in a lot of ways that shaped my own personal mission as an artist and the kinds of work that I do, but yeah, it's definitely scary to think about how do you make a space for yourself in an industry where you're not reflected in.
Has that changed now, David?
I think definitely it's shifting. I won't say, I think it's changing, and I think it is shifting, and I think we've seen waves and moments in time where, we've seen more representation and less at the same time, right? But I think definitely, there have been some incredibly big stories that have changed the field, that have changed the sort of canon of American theater and started to inject people of color in our narratives in ways that center us as whole characters and not just the sidekick. or not just the friend, the funny guy to the left, right? But really center us and center the complexity of our narratives in a way that's really exciting. And it's something that I hope continues to happen in this field, and not just in theater, but in all media.
Yeah, or the villain, for that matter.
Yes, or the villain, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah.
I remember talking to Gil Smith. He's the son-in-law of Ricardo Montalban. And he said that the only roles, and of course Ricardo was a very famous star in Mexico.
Yeah.
And he said the only roles that he was given was of the villain, right?
Right, yeah, the gangbanger, the drug dealer, the taxi driver, sort of ancillary. And we're seeing that shift little by little,
Yep. So your parents then, wanted you to have a plan B, and you never needed one. How were the years at NYU?
NYU was great. It was, I moved to New York in 2003, so it was 2 years after 9/11 and 2 weeks after the blackout. So my parents were terrified. I remember coming home one day and they were like, that's where you're moving to in 2 weeks and there's no power, right? So there was some fear and anxiety, but, I went in hungry to learn what I could learn. And I think one of the things that's most amazing about going to school, especially theater school in New York, is just having access to so much theater. I think for me, I really got to see a lot of work and work from Broadway and the sort of most funded spectacle to small shows that were happening in basements and in churches and experimental houses, and started to see that theater didn't just look one way. It wasn't just the sort of well-made play or the, American musical, that experimenting in form and experimenting with genre and experimenting with style and technology and all of those things, that started to open my mind up to what you could do with when you gathered an audience, right? And so, I think just having that access to that, and also having access to teachers who were working artists, who were out there in the field. So all of the connections I was making, they also opened up opportunities for me professionally. And so, some of my first internships and my first jobs were actually with teachers of mine, who saw something in me, who believed in me, and who gave me that opportunity to come and have access to their rehearsal room to watch and to learn how theater is made, right? Because it's one thing to learn about it in a classroom, and it's another thing to do it, right? You could learn about making theater in a classroom forever, but there's nothing like being thrown in a room with real people who have real opinions that might differ from yours, and trying to find a way to bring a community together to tell one singular story, right? And so as much as you know about, okay, I know about composition, or I know about staging, or I know about table work, I know about design, right? It's very different when you're actually collaborating. And so having that access to those rooms was critical for me to have that transition from student of theater to practitioner, and so that was amazing. And New York is so alive, and there's so much to do, and there's so much access to not only theater but all other kinds of art, dance, opera, visual art, music, clubbing, nightlife, which I think is so theatrical and has informed my practice in a lot of ways. And so just having access to all of that, I think really blew open for me what I thought I knew theater was. And at NYU, I made a lot of really incredible connections and relationships with artists who I'm still working with today, artists who I started a theater company with, and who, there were aligned values, and, I think found my community and the people where there was value alignment. And, we all set out to do the same thing, which was really to sort of change the game, to change the field, and to make space, to continue to make more space for our stories, So I think all of that was really thrilling. And I think knowing that New York was so big and there was so much space for it made it feel possible.
It was quite a transition from the orange groves,
yeah,
for sure. So A couple of interesting things. You said you mentioned that nightlife has had a lot of impact on you on your work, and nightlife is theater and drama in many ways.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, I think about like, what is the space in which people gather, and so like going out and going to the club. I love drag shows, and I think, drag is such theater. It's such putting on a character and spectacle, and there's still an incredible amount of storytelling that happens in that. And so, I was working as a costume designer actually for Bibi Zahara Benet, who won the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race, and was trying to tell her story and was developing these pieces, and so helping her connect to an audience in a space that wasn't your traditional theatrical venue, right? I think a lot of people think about theater and they think about, okay, I have to go into a dark room, I have to turn my phone off, I can't talk to anyone, I have to be quiet, I have to sit still, I have to like listen to this play. Do you know what I mean? And I think Nightlife introduced me to a different relationship that work and storytelling could have with an audience, right? I think of going to see drag shows, I think of going to see ballroom culture, and going out and seeing the ways in which the audience is such an active participant in the experience of storytelling. And I think we're starting to see some of that now in theater with like more sort of immersive work or audience engagement, right? But outside of that too, I think it was more just about the relationship, is like what is the work trying to do to an audience, and what does a work need from an audience, right? I like to think of theater not as a consumer sport, right? I think a lot of people come to the theater and they like, sit down, cross their arms, and they like are like, okay, entertain me. But I think of theater as this relationship with an audience, right? Like as I on stage can give to you, but I also need from an audience. It's not just sit there and be quiet. It's actually sit there and receive, but also what does an audience give back, right? They give back applause, laughter, tears, right? But they also give back parts of themselves. They see themselves reflected, and there's a reciprocal relationship, I believe, that wants to happen in the theater that keeps it alive, right? And I think I learned a lot about that in Nightlife and in seeing drag shows and in seeing, these spaces where audience could contribute to the experience.
Very interesting. And then, David, as an artist, you are able to observe the viewer seeing themselves in you.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing, as an audience member, I have found myself in stories that don't look like me, right? I think we've all been asked to see ourselves in stories that don't look like us. And it's possible, right? And what's thrilling is being able to put stories on stage that do reflect my lived experience, my lived reality, and to put it on stage in hopes that it will reach an audience that looks like it or that has that lived experience. But I think also audiences that don't have that lived experience, right? There's something about theater that gives an audience access into worlds that maybe they're unfamiliar with, right? And it allows you to create empathy and connection and understanding about people and worlds that maybe you've never been to and you might never go to, right? Or you might not have access to all the time. And I think there's something really incredible about that. And I think, when I'm making theater and I'm doing it and I look around at the audience, I love seeing as diverse an audience as possible, see themselves, see parts of me, parts of what I'm wanting to share through the work, and make connections that I don't even think they knew they were gonna make, right? To find that sense of empathy and that sense of understanding, because I think a lot of times theater can give people access to stories that they just don't have access to in their daily life. when done right.
The sense that I get from hearing you is that by the time you were finishing at NYU, this idea of making space was becoming more central in your thought.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think, it was at NYU that I first heard the expression artist of color, right? And I was like, that makes sense to me. I identify as that. I had not heard that. I didn't know. Like, I knew there wasn't always space for me, but there was something about a teacher of mine who was talking about being an artist of color, and it helped me find community, right? I think I struggled when I was younger, as a Latino artist, I struggled really connecting with my community, as my Latino community, and I think some of that is language. I'm not fluent in Spanish, and sort of like just finding my community there, but opening it up and sort of saying stories of people of color, of that sort of connection of the ways in which actually we, as a sort of larger global majority, could relate and connect to each other. That made me really excited. It gave me a larger sense of a community. And so it was through there, and through a relationship that I had with several friends of mine that I was in school with, who were graduating and were looking to continue making theater together and to find an artistic home for ourselves to work. And when we were graduating, it didn't exist. There were a number of theater companies of color that were sort of out there and existed, but sort of pathways into those and pathways into the larger white institutions felt limiting. And so a group of artists set out and said, what would happen if we made something ourselves? And I actually was not at that first meeting, so I'm not technically one of the founders of the Movement Theater Company, but early on I was invited by a group of artists who I love, who were starting something, who were starting the movement, and its original intention was to be a home for artists of color to get to develop and make work, and to get to do it from a place of wholeness and complexity, and that really became our mission. And I think early on, I felt that calling. I remember when they literally called me and asked me would I be interested in applying at the time to be the artistic director. And I had no idea what that meant, but I remember going and interviewing and just talking about like what I felt the power of theater was, how it could bring people together and community. And, I was invited to be a part of the company. And that was our mission early on, was like, we're going to make this space. And I think both literal space, but also not a metaphor, but a literal space, but also an idea, a space that like space inside of ourselves to believe and to dream into our expanses, in a way that I think we weren't finding in other places. There were still very limited opportunities, or there was still only like one job that everyone was being interviewed for. And it was like, but we're all so different. We're all so radically different. How do we all fit into this one job category? And so I think that was exciting, was saying like, what if we make theater together? And what if we create these plays and these worlds that actually invite the sort of intersectional realities of all of you to exist in one play, and that was really the mission of the movement, was like making space for artists of color to dream as big as possible and as full as possible and as whole as possible.
But it had to start with you making space within your own heart to believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. With all of us, just to believe that it was possible, and none of us knew what we were doing. It was like, we had taken a couple of classes on like forming a theater company, but we didn't really know what that meant, and we had made theater, but producing it from scratch, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so, it was really sort of a game of trial and error, and receiving a lot of feedback from our community, and from the people we were making theater with and for, to find out like, are we doing this right? What do we need? And 18 years later, we're still a company, and we're still sort of carving out spaces for artists of color to dream into their Herculean ideas.
And these, remarkable individuals who with whom you set out on this endeavor to create a space. You met all of them at NYU?
Not all of them. Well, there was originally, I want to say, like 12 artists who came together, who were all graduates of NYU. And two of the founders are Eric Lockley, who is still a part of the company, and Jonathan McCrory, who is now actually the artistic director of the National Black Theater. But the three of us, Eric and Jonathan were in my very first play I directed at NYU, and I've developed plays of theirs, and we've worked together for a long time. And then as we started forming the company, word started to get out about what we were making, and then new people started to come in. So Deidre Harrington came in early as an intern, and now runs the company with us. And she went to school at Vassar, but came and met us at a internship fair, had heard about the company. Taylor Reynolds, who was a producing artistic leader for a while and just stepped away a couple years ago to focus on her directing career. She was a student at Carnegie Mellon, and she also met us at an internship fair, had heard about us. Ryan Dobrin, who is now one of the producing artistic leaders, he's our newest member. He also came in as an intern. And these artists who, as we made a name for ourselves, word got out and people started to hear about us, and so younger artists of color started to look for us. And so now the four of us, it's Deidre Harrington, Eric Lockley, Ryan Dobrin, and myself, who serve as the producing artistic leadership team. And there have been many others who have come through and helped shepherd this organization for over the last 18 years.
Awesome. David, what did you guys produce and develop in the early days?
Yeah. So our first production was in 2010, and it was a play called Bintu by Kofi Kwahule, and it was translated by Chantal Bilodeau. And it was a play that I actually studied when I was in a West African Francophone theater class. And I had read it, and it was sort of random. I remember one day we had a holiday party for the movement, and we were like, let's read this play. Someone had a relationship with Chantal, who had been translating a lot of Kofi's plays. Kofi Kwahule is from Côte d'Ivoire, and had been translating a lot of his plays from French into English, and so had a real relationship with the French embassy in New York, and they were looking for someone who wanted to produce one of the plays. And they had a $10,000 grant that they would give to a theater company. And, we were like, $10,000? We could do a play for $10,000. You can't do a play for $10,000. And, Bintu was a cast of 16 people. It was a huge play, and we were like, let's do it. We have this money. We had a relationship with the Harlem School of the Arts. And so we set out to do it. And we did it as a workshop production, which meant we had 16 performances. We ended up getting this incredible cast. We paid very little to everyone, and we had a beautiful design. And I remember we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know to invite reviewers or anything like that, but somehow randomly, the New York Times emailed us, and they're like, we want to send someone to review the play. And we're like, okay. And so the New York Times came one day, and we got a really great review, and it said the Movement Theater Company is the theater company to watch, and I think it sort of put us on the map. And it was really what felt amazing about doing that show was we were making theater in Harlem. We were really thinking about the community in Harlem, and this play was really looking at African communities and immigration, and it's centered around this young girl who was the leader of this gang, but sort of empowered, and her family who was trying to tame her. And so, it felt like a piece that as we were building an audience in Harlem, like our audience would really connect with. And so that was really exciting. And then from there, we really wanted to start developing our own work. And so one of our earliest playwrights, who is one of my best friends, his name is Harrison David Rivers, we started developing work with him. And so the next play we did was a piece called Look Upon Our Lowliness, which, actually came out because we had so many friends, young, queer, Black and brown actors, who were all auditioning for like the same gangster role, right? And I was like, first of all, none of you are a gangster. Second of all, you're all so different. Like, how are you, what? It made no sense, you know? And I remember turning to Harrison and being like, here is this community of incredible actors who are just hungry to work. What happens if we put them all in one play? And Harrison was really into it. And so we developed this play, and it centered a group of 8 queer men of color. And they were navigating with the death of one of their closest friends. And so it was really a piece about life and death and about community. And we built an audience around that. You know, we went out and looked for places where there were alignment of values, whether it was in art or literature, and would go to things and bring the actors and real form meaningful connections to try to get people to say, hey, we're putting on this play. It's a brand new play. You've never heard of it, but we're trying to center these stories. And so, you know, that was our second piece. And then we continued doing things like that, was like building work intentionally for a community that we saw had a real need. And then in 2018, we had probably our biggest show, which was a production of a stunning play by Alicia Harris called What to Send Up When It Goes Down, that was directed by Whitney White. So it was the first time that someone outside of the producing artistic leadership team was directing the show. And it was a piece that centered around uplifting Black people in a world that was centered around anti-Blackness, right? And so it was a sort of ritual piece that centered healing and really invited an audience, a diverse audience, to come and understand the very real realities of racism and anti-Blackness in this country and participate in this ritual that then ultimately ended with the Black audience remaining in the theater and the non-Black audience being asked to leave, and sort of splitting an audience to close out the ritual. And it was a piece that, again, like in a moment in time and in a community that we were building, we recognized our audience needed spaces like that, space for them to feel whole. And so, you know, Alicia's play really provided that. And I think that really sort of put us on the map in a different way, because we got a lot of attention and a lot of people really wanted to see and support that show, because it was just doing different things in the theater than they had seen, you know. And I think Alicia is one of the great artists, both Alicia and Whitney, who sort of knew what they wanted. They were such clear intentions, and it was really exciting as a producing team to align ourselves with those intentions and to sort of tell that story as authentically as possible and as honestly as Alicia and Whitney intended it to be.
Had that been done with the audience earlier, where you asked a section to...
There had been, you know, obviously there have been times, and I think, you know, there's other pieces of theater, like I think of Jackie Sibley's Drury's Fairview, which was done at Soho Rep and also at Berkeley Rep, that had done, you know, experimented with audience relationship and, you know, asked people to do it. But I think Alicia's play was, I'm not going to say the first, because obviously, like, there's so many plays out there that I don't know, but I think it was, you know, one of the first real big pieces in New York at that time that was really dabbling with the idea of theater as ritual, which we're starting to see so much more, you know, and I think that that made it pretty unique.
In the early days, you were developing, you know, the production, but you seem to be also developing an audience, right? You had to go out and get people in.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, I think that's it's an ongoing, continued thing, I think, of the theater, right? It's like it's not just what you're making, but it's who are you making it for, you know, is a big question. And so it was really interesting. I think, you know, we were committed, and we still are committed to serving our audience uptown in Harlem. But I think at the time that we started making, theater uptown, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to gather around sort of cultural touchstones, right? Like there was definitely like a couple of museums, and there was definitely like NBT, the National Black Theater was there, but they had sort of slowed down on some of their programming. And so there were some spaces, and Harlem was gentrifying, and so like communities were starting to come up there, and you were starting to see more restaurants and things form. But I think we sort of realized, oh, there is an audience up here. And like in order to go see theater, everyone has to travel downtown or to Brooklyn. And so what would happen if we brought theater uptown more? And again, like there were Classical Theater of Harlem, there were lots of places that were doing it, but we were like, what if we were a part of that? And so, we formed a relationship with the Harlem School of the Arts and started making theater there. But then the challenge was, who's our audience? And so it really, we really started sort of a grassroots, like, how do you go and because we didn't have a venue that was our own that we could just invite people to, we were renting venues. It really became about like how do we go and find people? How do we connect with them? Not as like salespeople, not like come see my play, but as like, who are you? This is who I am. What are you looking for? Oh, this is what you're into. Oh, I'm actually making something that's comparable. How does that sound? And forming real relationships and real partnerships too. We started a program at the movement called Harlem Nights, and that it was the intention of that was to take non-traditional theatrical experiences into non-traditional spaces. So we would do monologue slams in hotel bar lobbies or in a restaurant. We'd go and do theater pieces at a movie theater uptown. Or, one time we did a partnership with Studio Theater where they had an exhibit on the artist Romare Bearden, and we commissioned a bunch of artists to write plays inspired by the work of August Wilson, who was deeply inspired by Romare Bearden's work also. And so it was a way for us to sort of say, like, how can we bring theater to different venues, and how can we make those relationships and also uplift these communities and these businesses that were run by people of color and create an ecosystem uptown that was benefiting all of us, right? And so it was really exciting to form these relationships with restaurants and bars and, shops and to sort of say, hey, can we come do a play here? And can we tap into your audience? Like, you have an audience. We'll bring some work that they can come to, and then, they'll learn more about your business, but also about what we're doing.
People were open to that
and people
idea?
were open. Yeah, we had lots of really incredible partnerships that we continue to go and make theater at some of these places, and it's really exciting because I think, it is an alignment with our values of uplifting the work of people of color and, uplifting these businesses that are also struggling to find their own audience. And it's like, hey, if we can bring the audience we've cultivated to your restaurant, they'll come back and eat food there. But also, if you could bring your audience that you've been cultivating and they can come see something of ours, all of a sudden we're both building an audience together. And so that was really exciting.
So you made their audience enjoy their venue,
exactly,
right? But be able to see you, right? So
exactly,
it's a natural alignment that way.
Yeah,
David. But David, it takes so much to develop a theater company, right? People only think of theater, as acting, right? But there's so much more. So let's delve a little bit deeper into that, and then on the other side, many of us might have, observed people coming to us and say, hey, come see my play. So, being a salesman is something that people know of, right? Artists many times have to do it, and folks like you have done that, or, building these kind of partnerships. But there's so much more. It starts with the script, right?
Yeah. Most times it starts with a play, and a script and a writer and someone who has something they want to say. And then, building out a team, there's producers, then you've got a director, you've got designers, you have to get actors, you need a stage manager, then once you get into a theater, it's like front of house staff and ushers and a stage crew, who's there, a wardrobe crew, who's there making sure that the clothes and the costumes get refreshed every single night, box office, you know? And in a lot of ways for us at the movement, when we were first starting out, we sort of did it all. You know, we were our whole team. There was, I think at the highest, there was 5 of us running the company together, you know, and we'd maybe have a couple of interns or a couple of volunteers who'd help out, but we were doing everything. You know, we were managing the box office, then we'd run over and manage the coat check, then we'd run over and seat people because we'd be like, here's your ticket. Then we'd be like, okay, then afterwards we'd be like picking up all of the things and cleaning up the theater, you know? So I think a lot of ways, we as a small but mighty team, and I think this is very indicative of a lot of small theater companies, a lot of big theater companies too. You know, people are taking on multiple jobs because it's a whole community that makes work. It takes a whole village to put on a play. Even if you're just seeing a one-person show, you know, it's not just about one person. There's a whole crew of so many people who are involved in making that, and everyone plays their own part in helping to shape that story. And I think then the role of the director is like, how do you pull all of those many people with varying different lived experiences together to try to tell as cohesively singular a story as possible?
David, let's delve a little bit deeper into each of these aspects. You know, how do you choose a script?
You know, I mean, I think I read a lot of plays for work and also for myself. And I think for me, I'm always excited by a play that scares me, you know, in some way, whether it's something that I don't know how to do on stage or something that is sort of like shakes me to the core, either what it's saying politically or socially or the characters. I'm really drawn to work that is about real relationships, you know, so for me, like, I love work that is tackling an issue, you know, that is sort of social or political. I'm less excited by a soapbox play. Like, I don't want to be yelled at and told how to feel, right? I'm more interested in a play that is gonna tackle these large issues through the people that it affects, you know, because I think most people don't want to get just yelled at, right, or spoken to or told, this is how you should think, right? I think most people will find their way into complex plays that maybe show 2 characters who have differing views, but they're both right? And you're sort of like, oh, like these are both right, so what is it? You know, and I think that's where it's more exciting, where plays that ask questions or plays that challenge an audience to wrestle with the question rather than spoon feed them an answer, you know, and I think for me that's exciting. That's what I look for. I also look for plays that are inherently theatrical. They have something either in what they're doing formally or structurally in the writing, or something baked into the way it's actually written that demands that it be seen on stage, right? I think there's a lot of plays, I like to call them Netflix plays, you know, that are sort of like, I could watch this on my television, right? There's not, like, what is the purpose that's calling us to sit in a room together, you know? And I don't think that always means that it has to have some, like, wild, big theatricality. I think some of the most sort of simple, straightforward naturalism or hypernaturalistic plays can be wildly theatrical because the questions that it's asking of an audience are so big that, like, it's actually about wrestling with them together. And so I think those are things that really excite me. I love language. So I love plays that play with language. You know, plays that play with multiple languages is really exciting. Plays that have heightened poetic dialogue, I really am always excited by, because it's like, how do you tackle that? How do you make that accessible? You know, so I think those are things. I'm definitely always excited by plays that center people of color and center them from a place of complexity. I'm less interested in what I would call like trauma porn, you know, plays that are just about trauma, which I think I'm not afraid of sort of darker, I actually love sort of heavy, darker plays, right? But I think I'm more interested in work that feels like even in the dark, in the bleak, in the heaviness, that there's still an element of hope or a question of a question of hope in there that's wrestling for us to think about the people, not just from the place of their trauma, but also from the place of resilience and triumph. You know, so I think I'm really turned on by that when I'm looking at plays.
Awesome. And then how do you pick a cast?
Oh my God, I love casting. Well, I think casting is like 80% of your job as a director, right? Because like if you get the right actors, not your job is easier, your job is never easier, right? But if you get the right actors who just understand what it is you're doing, great. Casting, like casting directors, so I work with a casting director to begin to have a conversation about like, what do you think this world wants to be? What do you think, who are these characters, right? So it's really sort of like taking the information on the page and saying, these are the things I've learned about this character. This is how I want them to feel. I think oftentimes, like, especially like if you're reimagining a play or like trying to, like if a play was written for all white people and you're like, I want to inject people of color into this, like really sort of trying to understand, okay, who are these people and what are the qualities about them that are essential? I love auditions. I'm always looking for an actor who really wants to collaborate. Like I don't believe in being the like final authority. Like I'm not the like, actually I do believe in being the final authority, but I don't believe in being always right? Like at the end of the day, like I will be the one to like make the final decision as needed, but I'm really looking for someone who's going to challenge me. I have my ideas of how I view this character, but I'm really excited when an actor comes in and they have a very clear idea of what they view the character and where there is alignment and also where there is like, oh, that's different. I never saw it that way, but that's interesting. It helps me understand and unlock dimensions of the character that I didn't read on my own. And so much of that is like, I can only experience something through my lived experience. So when an actor comes in and brings a part of themselves to the play and unlocks something, it's just so thrilling, And so I love auditions. I love playing with actors. I'm always like, I was always telling casting director, I need 10 minutes. And then like 30 minutes later, they're like, we should have given you longer because I love to get in there. I love to see an actor make choices. I love to, give them an adjustment and say, let's try it this way and see, are they game to play? I think for me, I'm looking for an actor who's game to play, right? Like I love that you know what this is, but are you willing to try things differently just to see what we can learn? I think one of my least favorite phrases is like, I don't think my character would do that. It just feels so limiting. So as a director, I always love to propose questions as like, is there a world where, because the answer is always yes, there is definitely a world where that happens. Is that this world? I don't know. But at least it's the invitation to experiment and to play, and I think for me, that's what I really crave and look for. And also, on a fundamental level, like people that you want to spend a considerable amount of time with. I think that's the other thing. Like making a play takes several weeks. So you're locked in a windowless room with these people trying to play make-believe and put on the story. And the last thing that I look for is someone who's going to be difficult or not a team player or challenging in a negative way. It's like, I'm not paid enough. None of us are paid enough to sort of be in that situation, or abusive situation. So for me, I'm looking for people who are willing to play, who are open to exploration and who just are fun to be in a room with, which doesn't mean everyone has to always be happy. Like I think conflict is essential to making theater. It's essential, right? But can we do it generously? And can we bring our differing ideas and spar with them to make the story the best it's possible, as opposed to sort of stop things from happening?
And design is such a complex thing.
So complex, yeah.
Right. There is the set, the score, the costume, the lighting, the sound, the props.
Yeah. Sometimes projections, sometimes other elements, like if there's magic or flying or, so many elements that come into play. And I think each of those, it's like, what are they doing to forward the story? I love the expression, there's an expression, it's like, don't put a hat on a hat. And I love that expression when it comes to design, because you're like, if if the set is intended to make the play spooky, and the light is intended to make spooky, and the sound is intended to make the play spooky, and the costumes are intended to make the play spooky, like everything is doing the same thing. So where's the counterpoint? So I like to think about that in design. It's like, okay, like how do we, like at a certain point, if everything is spooky, nothing is spooky anymore, right? You know, if everything is dark, darkness doesn't make sense. You know, you need light to understand dark. You need dark to understand light. You know, you need a moment of loud in order to really understand a moment of silence. You know, if a play is entirely silent, at a certain point, silence isn't important, right? So it's like, how do you create that? And I think about that in design as like, okay, we're each here to tell a story, but we have to understand what part of the story are we trying to tell, you know? Where are we trying to do one thing with this, another thing with this, another thing with this, another thing with this, so that then all of those complement each other to then tell something more complex and whole, you know? And so it gets really tricky. You know, the production manager, production director is overseeing all of the production departments. So they're overseeing light, sound, set, costumes, you know, projections, all of it, you know, and they're there to really manage the execution of all of those elements. You know, there's a timeline with which those elements have to come in. Like, you can't build the set first before you hang the lights, because then you'll never get up to the lighting grid. So you've got to hang the lights first, then you've got to build the set. You've got to know, oh, hold on, props has to install, but they can't install because everything's painted. So I think production management is really trying to figure out how all of these elements, who all need the same amount of stage time. You know, everyone needs dark time. I need it to be, or quiet time, you know? Like the sound designer, I need it to be quiet so I can hear, set my volumes. But they can't have quiet because the set people need to come and build the set, you know? And so like the production team is really there to sort of help orchestrate and conduct the ways in which all of those different departments are coming in. For instance, I'm working on a show now where an idea that I had is I want there to be a tree, and then I want it to black out, and then I want the tree to fall in the blackout. But I don't want anyone to come and touch it, and it needs to fall, right? And so like the set designer is like, great, right? And so we designed this thing. But like, is the set designer figuring out the logistics of how it's made? Not necessarily. They're gonna have to be involved in it, but I think that's where, you know, you've got this technical crew and you've got these people who are drafting and who are sort of planning out, you know, so like, you know, the set designer will make the set, they'll have the drawings, they'll give it to the technical crew, but then the technical crew will sort of go, okay, how do we budget this? We have to break it. How much wood is needed? Okay, how many pieces of wood do we need to cut out all the pieces that are needed to build this puzzle? Do you know? And so like that becomes a whole other crew of technicians who are like literally looking at the design and sort of going, I'm here to help you figure out the feasibility of making that happen, you know? And so that's a whole other crew of people who are sort of, and then reflecting back to the designer, okay, this is impossible. And then the designer comes to the director and is like, hey, this is not gonna work, but we figured out a way to do it like this. Does that work? You know, so it really is a whole thing. You know, or like same with like a costume shop, you know, like the costume designer isn't necessarily the one who's gonna build all the things. You know, the costume shop is gonna build it, but you know, we might need a quick change. We might need you to go from this, you know, Victorian dress, and then in 30 seconds, we need you to be in a swimsuit, right? And so, because that's what the play needs. And so like the costume shop is helping, and the technical side of the drapers and the stitchers and the technicians in the costume shop are helping the costume designer figure out, okay, how do we quick rig this? How do we do that in a way that still feels authentic to the period without putting a giant zipper in the back? Okay, we don't want Velcro because it's a quiet moment. We don't want to hear that, right? So there's all of these choices that are being made technically to help execute the thing as cleanly, as efficiently, as cheaply most of the times as possible, you know? And so all of those different technicians and people are working in the back to try and problem solve Okay, so you want the house to break open and then fly up. Okay, how do we do that? Without it ever looking like it's going to break open and fly away, and so that's where I think technical production and production teams come into play, is like they're helping figure out the logistics.
David, to be honest, this is a oh my God moment for me to try to understand what it takes to bring these thought experiments, that's how they start with, to bring them to life, right?
I mean, it's similar, I would say, to probably tech, right? There's someone who has an idea, but they're working with program coders and technicians to sort of figure out the back end of, I have this vision for this thing, this platform I want to make that's going to do it, but I don't necessarily know all of the ways. And so all of that team. So I think it's very similar to, or like a construction work, like an architect. The architect might design the building, but there's a whole crew of engineers who are helping figure out how to. And I think it's very similar to how theater works,
I wish it was more entertaining.
Yeah. We get to laugh though, right?
Yeah. No, we laugh at ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what people in tech do, when we bomb things all the time. David, I think there are, thank you so much for that, overview of what goes behind the scenes. It's so awesome to know. David, the year is 2022.
Yeah.
And you make a decision to start working at the Berkeley Rep.
Yeah.
How did that come to be?
Yeah, so, I met Joanna Felser, who's the artistic director at Berkeley Rep now, in 2019, when she was at New York Stage and Film. And I fell deeply in love with her mind, and I think I have such respect for her taste and her vision of theater and her passion for new work. And so actually I came to Berkeley Rep first a couple months before I moved here to direct a play. So I directed a play at Berkeley Rep called Sanctuary City, which was a play that I was in love with for so many, many, many years. And wanted to direct so bad. And, when the opportunity came up, when Joanna invited me, I was like, yes. And then when I got to Berkeley Rep, I fell in love with the venue. I fell in love with the theater. We are fortunate and blessed to be a theater that can produce at scale. We produce 7 shows a season. We have all of our shops on site. So we have our scene shop, our costume shop, our prop shop, our sound and lighting departments, all on site. So when you're making a play, which is rare. A lot of theaters don't have that. And in New York especially, there are very few theaters, if any, that have all of those elements. Half the time you're like, where's my set? And they're like, in Canada somewhere, it'll be here next week, or in North Carolina at a shop elsewhere, just because of space. So we're fortunate at Berkeley Rep to have the space and the incredible artisans and craftspeople who are storytellers in their own right to sort of put the thing together. And so for me, I got there and I cried. I just was like, this is a beautiful venue. It's what, when I was in high school thinking theater would be like, it's what I imagined, a space where all of the departments were there and everyone was working together. And as you were developing a play, you could poke your head in and see the set being made in real time. And so that was really cool. And I really fell in love with Berkeley. I thought, Berkeley in the Bay Area is just, it's beautiful weather, quality of life, all of that. But also the Berkeley Rep audiences are really intellectually rigorous. They want to be challenged by work. They love a good story. And so all of that made me really excited. I was like, oh, this is a really interesting audience.
What kind of work are you currently doing in terms of the stories?
Yeah, so, I'm really excited. We have a beautiful play going on right now called Mother of Exiles by Jessica Wong that I championed a lot. And we're, it's a piece that explores immigration and lineage and climate all through the lens of one American family story over 160 years. So it's told in 3 parts. And so being able to champion that play and bring that is exciting. I'll be doing, I'm going to start rehearsals next month for a production of Arthur Miller's All My Sons, which is a canonical play, my first time tackling a big canonical work. But I'll be doing it with Jimmy Smits and his wife, Wanda de Jesus. who are both Puerto Rican, and centering it around a Puerto Rican family as the Kellers, a Black family as the Deaver family, and a white immigrant family as the Baylesses. And so looking at this play that was historically written for an all-white cast and has been performed a number of different ways, but looking at it through a sort of contemporary lens of American race and class, but setting it in its authentic period. So setting it in 1946 in Ohio, in a neighborhood that contained, Black and brown and white immigrant families, and sort of looking at it through a lens to sort of see, it's a play that is about the American dream and about a sort of scathing examination of the American dream. And so I've connected to it ever since I was in high school, obviously like my family that feels a part of that, but really wanting to look at who that dream was built for, and as you look at people of color in that world, what sort of complications and added layers get unveiled. We're not changing a thing of text. It's the play as it has always been. But I think by putting a diverse community of actors and in to play the role of the characters, my hope is that it will unlock new things in the play. And I think it's probably the greatest play in the American canon. It's such a beautiful play, so it's such an honor to get to do that. And then we're closing out our season with a brand new musical of a piece called The Lunchbox, which is actually based off of a indie film by Ritesh Batra, this Indian filmmaker. And so it takes place in Bombay, and it is about the Dabwala system and the Dabawala. Yes,
right,
thank you. And the lunchbox delivery system. And so it's based off of the film, and it tells the story of this woman who is in a loveless marriage, who makes her lunch for her husband, but somehow the delivery system misplaces it and delivers it on the desk of this man who is a widow. And they start this epistolary relationship, writing love letters back and forth through this lunchbox delivery system. And it's a beautiful, beautiful musical. Ritesh, who is the original filmmaker, is translating it into a musical with his collaborators, Daniel and Patrick Lazor, who are writing the music, and it'll be directed by Rachel Chavkin, who is a Tony winner for Hadestown. And so that's coming. And so I think just looking at those stories and looking at the impact that being a part of the artistic department and being able to champion and shepherd these stories. And again, so much of this is also where Joanna sees the company going. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. That is remarkable work,
Yeah.
David. David, let's switch gears a little bit and start to talk about the future.
Yeah.
Is technology, specifically AI, having an impact on theater?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the big, scary conversation that's happening, around AI. It's here, it's real, it's happening, and I think it's complicated. We have a lot of conversations around it at Berkeley Rep, and, are really sort of interrogating where does it feel incredibly useful. Right? There are places where it's incredibly useful. Simple things, taking notes at meetings, helping to, synthesize a conversation, right? And then I think there are places where it gets sort of ethically more complicated, right? Like, what does it mean to use AI in making artwork? What does it mean to use AI in writing plays, right? And I think those places are where it gets a little more gray area, right? Because we are an industry that is really centered around artists and craft, right? And so when you have technology that is starting to do some of the things that artists do, it can get tricky, but I feel like I do think that good art can be made using AI. I don't think that AI can make great art, right? So I think there are artists who are, of course, examining it and playing with it and trying to see and trying to interrogate it, but still leading the conversation and in control. I think I'm less interested in the idea of like, hey, AI wrote this play, right? I'm like, what is that? That's scary and weird, But I think there's also a lot of ways that it's being useful in the sort of technical aspect of theater, in helping with things like automation and drafting and different sort of ways in which, there are artists who are still at the helm of figuring that out, but there are these tools that can make things quicker, help on expedited timelines, problem solve or double check things, So I think it's complicated, and it's an ongoing conversation that I know we're having at Berkeley Rep, and I know that it's happening in the field a lot. And I think for me, I'll say, I think it's naive to think that like we're never going to use it in the theater, right? Because it is happening. Like we use it to take notes and things like that. It is a part of the world. We use it when you're just Googling an answer, like it's there, right? But I think it's the question right now is like, how do we use it ethically, and how do we use it responsibly, and how do we ensure that it's not we're not using it to just replace labor and replace artists for capitalism,
Awesome, David. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've truly enjoyed speaking with you. What else would you like to share with our audience?
Oh my gosh. I would say, like there's great theater wherever you are, right? So wherever folks are listening to, like, I think there's this idea that like great theater only happens in New York, right? Or like Broadway is the only thing. And I just I think of myself as an artist who was deeply shaped by theaters of color, right? Like I started making theater at the Movement Theater Company, at INTAR, which is a Latina theater company in New York. At the Soul Project, which is another organization that I'm a part of that has championed Latina works, and sort of these smaller theater organizations of color, like I think of Latino Theater Company, Teatro Luna, Teatro Vista, Pregones, PRTT in New York, these companies that, Penumbra, in the Twin Cities, these companies that have been developing artists of color and developing the work of communities of color and building community, and really sort of like championing the diversity in the American theater, right? And so I just think about like those places that sometimes get overlooked or people don't go to or don't support. And I think, some of those small theaters, that's where your new great artists are getting the opportunity first, right? And so I think, for anyone listening, I would say, go and find what's the closest theater near you of all sizes. What's the small, scrappy little community theater or small group theater that's going, and how can you find ways to support them, showing up, buying tickets, making a donation, helping to continue to invest in the ecosystem of storytelling that exists across this country. There's great theater happening everywhere, so go out, go see some, support it, tell people when you see something you love, because word of mouth is huge to help us, continue to share our stories.
David, thank you so much for sharing your story and your passion.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you. Thank you for being on the Inference show.
Thank you for having me.